The Able to Care podcast is sponsored by Able Training Support Limited, who build partnerships with organisations to develop confidence and competence in their team to promote positive outcomes for all. Find the link in the description. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Able to Care podcast. I'm your host, Andy Baker. And on today's episode, we're going to be looking at what we call the 5 stages of grief, also known as the Kubler-Ross model. Now, many people have heard of this, or you will at least recognize some of the stages of the cycle in grief, because it has been shown on numerous media sites or in TV and film. So most of us become familiar. Even if we haven't experienced it directly ourselves, we're kind of familiar with maybe the stages that people go through related to death particularly. But one of the things I think worth understanding about this model is it doesn't have to just be related to death. It could be any kind of significant loss in our lives or any kind of major change or transition. So these are all the emotions that people typically tend to go through. It is important to kind of note that not everybody goes through all of these stages, okay? We're all different, we're all individuals, and nor do they necessarily occur in a specific order as well. So sometimes the imagery is shown in kind of a progressive or a linear kind of pattern, but actually it is kind of all over the place, and it's kind of can be revisited. And as we had the amazing Charlie talking about her experience of being a parent with a child with severe disabilities, then that grief cycle can keep coming back, and they can keep re-experiencing the grieving cycle every time there's a reminder that of the things that could have been. You know, it doesn't just go away. So people revisit stages multiple times as they process their grief. But here are the 5 stages, and we'll put them into some context as we're kind of moving through. Okay, so denial, often a first response to a loss. It kind of serves the idea is, or the principle is a defense mechanism. It helps us to numb the initial shock or pain. And sometimes it's denial and shock is sometimes referred to it in the model itself. But during this stage, we might really struggle to accept the reality of the loss itself, acting as though it hasn't occurred, or believing that a mistake has been made, or they must have got the information wrong, or that can't be happening, or things all change. Don't worry, they'll figure it out later. And it's that there must have been some mistake. It can't be happening. Then the language that we use related to that denial stage. The person may act as if nothing's happened. It may seem like, why aren't you upset? Because it's going to be fine, because nothing's going to change. Even if they're not saying it, their emotional kind of defense mechanisms kicked in, going, oh yeah, no, I know they're going to go, but they're just not acting in any way. They could be in a state of denial. The next stage, though, is anger. And anger is as the reality of the loss starts to set in. And this could be time. You know, as I said, I knew somebody who was like 7 months pregnant and in a state of denial all the way through before the loss set in. Now, it may perceive as loss, not pregnancy not being a loss, but this is where I try and help people to understand about the 5 stages of grief, that it's still a change. It's a loss of the life they thought they would have if they're then having a baby. So that may seem strange. Isn't that a positive thing? Isn't that a great thing? Shouldn't they be happy? But it's still a loss of something. To have one thing, you sometimes have to lose something else. And if the focus or the idea is on the thing that I should have had, that's still going to cause emotional disturbance and emotional distress. The denial then starts to fade with the anger stage. The feelings of anger starts to surface. This anger can be directed towards themselves. It's my fault. I shouldn't have let this happen. I should have taken more care. And this can be a real difficult time for people to go through because of the anger they direct towards themselves. But it could be anger directed towards others. It's where blaming comes in. It's where shaming comes in. It's aggression towards others. Or it could even be the person they've lost, or it could be the person that's left, or it could be whoever it is. It could be anybody where the anger is directed. The anger usually comes from a state of helplessness and frustration over the situation. As I've said in other podcasts, when we feel overwhelmed, we tend to go either into a destructive or a constructive state. And it's that kind of destructive. I must lash out. I must blame others. I must deflect this feeling away from myself because I don't have any control over it. And I feel helpless. And therefore the fight response starts to kick in. So A person might feel angry at the doctors. They might feel angry at their boss because they didn't let them go. They could feel angry at the child who's ruined their life or anything along those lines. Even though the child hasn't ruined their life, remember this is the way the person feels, not the actual facts of the situation. Now, after anger, the next stage that's referred to is then the bargaining stage. In the bargaining stage, individuals may dwell on the what if only statements. If I'd have done this, then I could have done this. If I hadn't have done that, then that wouldn't have happened. It's my fault that this happened and I should have done that differently. And they're kind of trying to navigate. They may try and make deals with kind of superstitions and things like that to reverse or lessen the loss, or please just make me feel better, or take this pain away, or I swear that I'll never do anything wrong again if you change this, or something along those lines. Whatever it is, they often appeal to a higher power, but it could be anything. It could be negotiating with the doctors related to a loss. It could be negotiating with the social workers as far as, but I want to go home from a child. Because we can put this into a context of, for those in looked after care, they go through a cycle or the stages of grief related to the transition from leaving their parents. And even if that home they originally came from was something that most of us would perceive as detrimental for the child's well-being, it's still a loss. It's still taking something away from them in their life that they thought was stable, they thought was normal, they thought was what they were going to have forever. Even if that may not have been good, they're still going to experience the grief and loss of that. We could experience from the loss of an item, from an object. It could be I lose the ability to do a certain thing I couldn't do before. I remember I went through a kind of a cycle of grief when I had a really bad knee injury. I have actually managed to overcome the knee injury, but it looked like I was never going to be able to, and I may not be able to do certain hobbies for at least a very long time again, or I may struggle to drive, or I may not be able to do what I do for a living. It was a real difficult time for me, and there was no death there. There was just purely an injury that I could still walk, I could still move, I could still do everything else, but it was a grief that I experienced from the losses of the things I felt I wasn't going to be able to do anymore that previously gave me joy or previously made a person feel safe or whatever it is. The next stage is then depression. I think it must be when the case of like, there's nothing I can do about this, moving away from that helplessness where the initial anger comes out. I can only sustain that anger for a time, and then it's going to be the realization. Depression is a stage when the individual fully kind of acknowledges the loss and its impact on their life. It's marked by deep sadness, regret, and a sense of emptiness. If we think of something like what's stereotypically known as like the midlife crisis for many men, for instance, or for people, is sometimes the loss of youth still causes this stress and distress and agitation, whether it be the denial stage or depression. This is what the kind of that stage of life, the crisis, midlife crisis, this is the same thing that's going on. It's a grieving process of what could have been, should have been, would have been, whatever it was, that's led us to where we are. And it all depends on where our focus is of the things we've lost rather than the things we've gained. It may cause from the depression. It could be obviously the sadness, and most people think about, but it could be just a sense of emptiness or just a loss of feelings, a loss of caring anymore, a lot being bothered by the things that used to make them happy. It can cause people to withdraw from social activities. A lot of people think depression is sadness, but it isn't. It's often described as just, I don't feel anything. I just feel no joy. It's more a lack of joy rather than necessarily sadness. Okay. So they might find then as a result of that, their motivation goes down. They find it difficult to engage in daily activities. And one of the specifics, for instance, within a lot of diagnostical criteria for depression or for mood disorders is actually ruling out grief, that there hasn't been a major loss or something, because depression is maybe a normal part or a typical part of the grieving process. It may not be the same as then chronic depression. Going through this journey, there's then a point of acceptance. Now, I talk a lot about acceptance, and this is, the wonderful Charlie also mentioned as far as, the difference between acknowledgement and acceptance. I think it's acceptance of the things that I can and can't change, accepting things for how they are. I think she referred to kind of acknowledging as the kind of, I recognize this is how it is, but I'm unwilling to accept that this is okay. I think is a really interesting way of looking at it. I accept that my son may have to look after himself when I die, but I don't want to accept that. So I'm going to put things in place to thing. And I think that's acceptance with the recognition of where I can and can't make change. So it's again, semantics, but acceptance doesn't necessarily mean just being okay with the loss, but rather acknowledging the reality of it. And I think that's important, isn't it? It's acknowledging the reality of it and learning to live with it, accepting that I can go on, accepting that it's okay to feel this way about it. It's a self-acceptance, not just accepting that this is what should happen. I never think anybody being attacked should accept being attacked, for instance, But it allows the person to then adjust their life, make adjustments, make changes, maybe put some more positive things in their life without the situation that they had before, without that other thing, shifting their focus of, okay, maybe I've lost those things, but I still have these things. And this is where kind of, I suppose the GPS episode I did with gratitude, perspective, and service can be a way of helping a person through this process to get to this point of acceptance that, hey, at least I can be grateful for this, or, at least I can put it into perspective, or I can still provide a service, or I can take this pain that I've experienced and use it to better others or to improve others or to help others or whatever it is. So this may be when a person's able to re-engage with friends and family and activities, and form new routines based on the changes that they've now had in life. New routines and new habits will have to start form as a result of that. So they are the 5 stages. So to go through again, we've got denial, we've got anger, we've got bargaining, we've got depression and acceptance. But as I said, this isn't a linear process. People experience these in different stages, in different orders. They may revisit certain stages at any time related to that grief or that loss. They may feel like, hey, I thought I'd moved on, accepted. And a bit like with the cycle of change, it's a case of we might get relapse, exactly the same. Nothing just kind of goes in a linear state. Everybody is going to go through this differently as well. Some might go through all 5 stages. Some may have additional emotions that aren't even captured by the model, like a complete nonchalance, for instance, of just, no, I don't care anymore. Some people go through that as a stage of that cycle of grief. But understanding these stages. So when I went through a major relationship breakdown, one of the things that I found really useful that, when I started doing therapy around this is I'd never really thought about it in that cycle of grief before, but it helped me to recognize that where I was in my cycle of grief was actually different from where my partner was in their cycle of grief. So I thought they didn't care, but they were just moved further through. So they were more towards the acceptance side of things, where I was still in shock and denial. Or it may have been kind of the bargaining side of things where I was there going like, I'll do better. I'll do better. But they were further or in a different place on that grieving cycle. So it isn't that the person doesn't care. It's just maybe a different place. They could be the angry stage and therefore lashing out, but it's just part of that grieving cycle. I think understanding this, the Kubler-Ross model, can help us to empathize with others. It can also help us to recognize where a person may be grieving something in their life that may not be a death. It could be a change. It could be a loss of their youth. It could be a loss of circumstances. It could be a loss of a job or a friend, or who knows what it could be that's triggering it. One of the things I think is so important, though, is that when we're looking at helping others or helping ourselves, that empathy is so important. Empathizing with the person who's going through this grieving cycle, making sure we're offering appropriate support, and knowing that it's a normal thing for people to go through these stages. Maybe you sometimes have to allow them to grieve rather than necessarily just suppressing and repressing their emotions. I think it's instinctive. Just go, hey, just feel better. Just get over it. Just come on out and cheer up. But actually might be a case of, no, it's actually right that I'm allowed to process this emotion. I'm allowed to get over this in the right way. And this is where then having people to share that with and, feeling connected can help me to overcome, but not feeling guilty and shameful about the fact that I'm finding it hard. I think, some of you out there may be fans of the Ricky Gervais series Afterlife, which I think is a a heart-wrenching kind of witness of a guy grieving his wife, and through the different stages and the depression and things like that he goes through, with hopefully acceptance at the end. But he did have people around him who tried to help or tried to be there for him, who were willing to sit, and sometimes he accepted it and sometimes he couldn't. But I think it's so important to do our best to connect with people and look at empathy. I think I've done some other episodes on empathy anyway, so I won't go in, but being willing to sit down in the hole with the person rather than telling them they need to climb out. I think many people, when they struggle, let's say I'm going through grief because I've found out I have a terminal illness myself, for instance. I'm going to be grieving my life at that point. Other people find it difficult to be around or to know what to say. And I think knowing where I am on the grieving cycle may be give an indication of how we should be responding. Are they angry and negotiating? Join me in my emotion first. Connection before correction, or connection before redirection, whichever way around it is, but connection first. So hopefully you found this session interesting. Maybe you can relate it to things within your world and situations you've gone through. I think it's a really useful tool and model for people to be able to understand others, not just themselves, but be empathic towards each other and be accepting of each other. If you found anything interesting, please like, comment, and share. Thank you.